The first question I have for you concerns the factional division within the Lesotho Congress for Democracy, the ruling party in Lesotho, which seems to be intensifying in the run-up to the elections later this year and early next. Do you think that this is just another case of personality clashes, or is there more substance to this?
Thank you very much, Mark. It's a pleasure really talking to you. To understand what is happening within the LCD, it is necessary to also understand the historical background and the culture that was cultivated in this party together with its forerunner, the Basotho Congress Party. This is a party which, that is the Basotho Congress Party, is a party that was literally the main independence movement in the country, although of course it was not the one that led the country to independence in 1966 for a number of reasons. It happened to be led by a charismatic figure whose charisma depended on playing individual leaders and factions within his party against one another. And he even coined an epithet where he says his party is like a big boulder rolling down a mountain, and in the course of that throwing pebbles which were supposed to be the small parties that were splitting from it. In fact, almost all the parties in Lesotho are actually historically breakaways from the BCP. And that tendency to split, which was always encouraged by him, seems to have stuck with the party. In his own last days as an effective leader, he was now very aged and very weak. There was an attempt to remove him from the leadership, but because the mass following attached to him as a person, not necessarily to the party, he broke away from the BCP in the late 90s and established the LCD while he was in office as Prime Minister. Something that generated a lot of debate and controversy as to whether or not that was constitutional, because here is a government that had come into office under the flag of a particular party, and then it literally walks out of that party, but then stays in office. I was one of the constitutional experts who says in our Westminster type of constitutional model, that was perfectly constitutional. Whether it was an ethical, moral thing to do, it's another thing, but I know that law and ethics are not always one and the same thing. Now, since the establishment of the LCD in 1997, if I'm right, it has already split twice. The second split was with the what is called LPC, when the then Deputy Prime Minister, Mr. Mahao, broke from the LCD to found this new party, the LPC. The second split occurred just before the last elections, when Mr. Tom Tabani, who initially had been a political advisor to Mokgele himself, broke out to found what is called the ABC. And now there is this impending split. You can always be sure it is going to happen. There are no issues around the splits. They are always driven by the culture that was inculcated by Mr. Mokgele from the 1960s of leaders fighting for power. As long as it did not touch him then, as long as it did not touch him, he would always encourage people to be fighting for power within the party. And so I don't think there are issues whatsoever. Incidentally, the two protagonists leading either faction, Mr. Madie, who is the de facto leader of the one faction, and Mr. Moleleki, who leads the other faction, were the closest of friends until recently, when it now emerges that the incumbent Prime Minister and leader of the LCD might opt to retire. And so the whole squabble is really an issue about succession. And so it has reduced itself to this factional fight. It is not even about the personalities. It is about power. Who succeeds who. That is all that there is to it.
Just to follow on from that, what would you think is likely to happen in the run-up to the elections? Because there seems to be intensifying this factional.
Yes, you know you know that one of the factions actually moved a motion for a national conference to be brought forward. So that they could pass a vote of no confidence in the existing executive, except in the Prime Minister and his deputy. The other faction used their youth wing to challenge the bringing forward of the conference in the Lesotho High Court, and they won. Essentially, what is happening there is that the executive that is dominated by Mr. Madie's faction wants to delay the conference such that it will be the faction that will nominate and approve candidates for local government. And they know that if the local government candidates belong to their faction, then that will be the basis upon which they will isolate the incoming executive. Because you see, those people now will be having a stake as local councillors and so on and so forth. And they will be alienated from the incoming executive. So that is the power play. And as a result, it is delaying the formal split, because it is a question of one faction seeking to trip the other. With the expectation that those who are not able to control the machinery of the party might even opt out and form their own party outside, as Tabani did 2 or 3 years ago. So it is not clear when this will actually crystallize into a formal split, because it is a question of the footwork in terms of which faction is outmaneuvering the other and when.
Right. There's recently been some changes made to the electoral law. Do you think this will result in a more representative or transparent democratic process? Or do you think there are deeper problems within democratic political development in Lesotho more generally?
There are two issues there. Lesotho adopted the mixed member proportional system a couple of years ago, and I happen to have been one of the principal architects of that, the model. First of all, in terms of motivating in the public discourse a move from the first past the post to a more proportional representative model, because we had a crisis of unrepresentativity with the first past the post electoral model. And then secondly, I was appointed as part of the judicial panel that had to arbitrate on the model, and so the mixed member model was almost a product that I had a very direct influence on it. But then there was this snag in terms of our judgment as the panel. We had said for the immediate elections, the country would go to elections on the 80% constituency basis and the 40% proportional. But then the constitution, and the reason we had done that was simply because of logistics, because the elections were very near and there wasn't much time to reconfigure the constituencies and so on and so forth. But then we recommended that going forward, the ratio of the two systems should be on the basis of a 50-50. In their mischief, the LCD, which at the time was the only party in parliament, only party in the sense that there was just one other member who did not belong to the LCD, and therefore the only party that could make the appropriate constitutional amendment, they deliberately decided to ignore the 50-50 ratios in amending the constitution and entrenched the 80-40. The consequences of that was that in the last elections, politicians found a loophole in that system whereby you could have candidates representing one party appearing on the constituency list of that party, and they also appear on the proportional representation list of another party. The result of that was that the LCD went into an unholy alliance with a smaller party called the National Independent Party, NIP, and ordered their supporters to vote for the LCD on the constituencies and vote for NIP on the constituencies, on the proportional list. What does that lead to? It leads to actually grouting out the other parties and also distorting the actual support base of the parties, more or less reproducing the very skewed representation that is typical of the first past the post electoral model. Thankfully, this present parliament is still by far the most representative in terms of the parties, because you have 10 parties in parliament as against one previously. And so this issue of distortion of representation, manipulating it in this manner, was the cause of what some call a political constitutional crisis in the past 2 or 3 years. And you know that SADC had to be involved in trying to mediate this whole thing. And so the present amendment is intended to actually ensure that there is no repeat of that particular distortion. To that extent, it will probably reflect a much healthier representation in Parliament than is the case presently. Even as I say that presently we have 10 parties. If the system had been played in a proper manner, those parties would have been represented by larger numbers than is the case presently. And that would have been to the disadvantage of the LCT, the ruling party.
All right. If we move on now to the economic situation, and bearing in mind the drop in SACU revenue, which has put the spotlight on the overall economic problems facing Lesotho, what do you think the government should be doing to confront this that they are not actually doing at the moment?
Well, two things that one can say about that. The crisis is as a result of the so-called financial meltdown, which some say is actually a crisis of capitalism on a global scale. Lesotho as a peripheral country in that system is obviously hit hard in more ways than one. First of all, this is an economy which has always not had an industrial base. You would be aware that the main employer in Lesotho is actually the government, and a little bit share in the textile industry. But even that textile industry itself, remember, was to the extent that it was flourishing, if one could say that, depended on AGOA, the American, which ran its course just a little bit ahead of the global meltdown. Hence, you began to see many of the companies that were operating from Lesotho assured of access market of their textile production in the United States, actually fleeing from around 2006 and so on and so forth, leaving hundreds and thousands of workers without jobs, including actually running away with their monthly pays. What does that do? It simply accentuated the unemployment situation in Lesotho. But before that, there had already been another crisis. The intake of Basotho workforce in the mining industry in South Africa, which was historically the biggest employer, began to decline as far back as 1987 or thereabouts, such that the mining sector in South Africa employs barely 40% of what it did in the 80s. Where do all of these people go? They go back to the country. They don't have pensions or any kind of wherewithal. Coinciding with what has been a collapse of the agricultural sector in that country, in part because of drought, and secondly because of the structural adjustments which were introduced in the early 90s. And so you have a country that now of course the circuit then becomes, an additional crisis when the revenue drops substantially. So you have a social economic crisis that is waiting, that is a bomb waiting to explode. Compounded by a very high prevalence of HIV/AIDS in the country. I think the second largest ratio of all countries. I think this is second or third. Yeah, could be third. Yes. That is the state of the country, an objective state of the country. How can it be resolved? I doubt if there is anybody who can say. The crisis at the end of the day is a function of the history of colonialism, where a small country was created artificially with no resources, with no investment to build an industrial base, and at the present moment it is too late to do anything in that regard. In my view, the reality is to reckon with the fact that the existing boundaries, which are a product of colonialism, are the only thing that will help to review. I mean, to attenuate this crisis from growing from bad to worse. That is my, so that Lesotho really becomes part of South Africa, because effectively, except for political reasons, the country is actually a labor reserve of South Africa and a dumping ground of South African goods. And the sooner Basotho come to terms that actually they are part of South Africa for all purposes, intents and purposes, the better, so that they can become part of a larger economy. Remember that economies of scale are the only rational basis on which you can deal with some of the problems that are afflicting the global economy presently.
Which brings us to Lesotho's status anyway with South Africa, because there are various practical obstacles at the moment facing the free movement of people. But of course, as you alluded to, that also comes within the broader question of what should Lesotho's relationship be with the country. Now, opponents of the merging, say, of the two countries, or the merging of Lesotho into South Africa, will say, no, that's going to destroy our national identity and all this sort of thing. What is your response to that, and how do you see that some of these practical issues of free movement that are affecting people just now?
The regime that was instituted by South Africa just about a year ago has visited untold inconveniences on Lesotho, but also inclusive of hardships. You have many Basotho who were working and possibly are still working in South Africa outside the framework of the law, which means having a work permit that allows you to work here. What this new regime has done is to cut off those people from either going back home, or if they find themselves the other side of the border, from coming into South Africa to look for job opportunities. As that is happening, for those who talk about sovereignty, South Africa is milking Lesotho. You know that it is fueling its industries with Lesotho water, especially here in Gauteng and neighboring provinces. But South Africa is making a lot of good use now of Lesotho's trained human resources. Lesotho is a strange country which is not shedding surplus trained manpower. It is actually shedding its best and remaining with those who have nowhere to go. That actually means that South Africa is actually benefiting in this relationship, while Lesotho is actually the loser. And so the absurdity is that there are, culturally speaking, more Basotho in South Africa than in Lesotho. Indeed, there is an indication of a negative population growth in Lesotho, because around 1982, somewhere there, the internal Lesotho population was estimated at 2.2 million. I believe that last year in December, the Minister of Finance said that the population is at 1.8. We do know that HIV/AIDS is part of the factors here, but I think the larger part of the explanation of the decline in the population is actually migration into South Africa. And I am saying the significance of this migration as against what we inherited more than 130 years ago. In the past, Lesotho was sending to South Africa unskilled labor, which was going to work in the mines, in the agricultural industries, and a few others in the harbors and so on and so forth. That was the nature of the outflow, population outflow in those days. Unskilled and semi-skilled labor. Now, I've already explained to you that unskilled labor or semi-skilled labor has been thrown back into Lesotho by what has been happening in the mining industry, in particular in the last 20 years. Meanwhile, South Africa is actually attracting skilled force into its economy. Now, anybody who cannot understand what this dynamic means, and the only difference that influences this pattern is those political borders. The consequences is that you are actually left with a situation of a huge population that cannot generate wealth.